On today's show, we're going to be talking about how to get more leads from your website by causing shoppers to be generally interested in what you have to offer and impressed by how you present yourself. There's a lot to this topic, from understanding your audience to refining the specific types of information you are presenting on your website. Do it right and you will reap the rewards.
Welcome to Strategy Talks by Funeral Results Marketing, where funeral professionals discover the latest marketing strategies that get results. Now join Robin Heppel and Brian Young as they share their insights and experiences to help you and your firm during these ever-changing times in the funeral profession.
Well, welcome to another episode of the Strategy Talks by Funeral Results Marketing. And before getting into today's topic, I wanted to let you know to stick around to the end of the show to find out how you can get your free self-assessment report card to help you with your website.
Great, Brian. So today we want to talk about how to get more leads from your website and how to be more appealing online. And to help us do that, we're going to do some Q&A with Brian here, who has worked in this space for much of the last 10 years. So Brian, why does one website get more interest, more leads, more shopper calls than another website?
That's a good question, Rob. And really, it's just a matter of cause and effect. Because shoppers found your website, and then after finding it, because they saw and read what appealed to them, that's what causes them to reach out to you. So obviously there's two pieces there. There's getting found, and second, there's being appealing. And I know a couple weeks ago you talked about how to make your website more SEO friendly, which is certainly all about the getting found. And I know in the future podcasts we'll discuss effective advertising methods. So those are other things that can help a person's website and business to be found. But then the question is, what comes next? And that's what we want to answer here today. How do we maximize the appeal of the website that shoppers go to after viewing that advertising? You know, is it all just about the design of your homepage, the graphics that it's wrapped in, or are there other ingredients in the recipe of a website's appeal? And actually, there are a lot of other ingredients, and that's what we want to examine in our podcast today. Well, I always like to start from the big picture and get the context, and then delve into the details. You know, the death care industry is a male-dominated industry, but who's the target audience? And a lot of owners aren't aware just how large the target audience is on the female side of the line. 72% of death care shoppers in America are women, and that number actually comes from a 2010 ICCFA commission study they had performed by Rhonda Harper. She's a marketing to women guru. She's handled Walmart's accounts and written for Forbes, and she's a top CEO and marketing expert to women. And so that number isn't surprising to the few people who were investigating that before, but it was nice to hear it from an outside source. Almost 3/4 of all death care shoppers in the States are women.
Well, that's a really interesting stat, and maybe it's kind of shocking the first time you hear it, but it makes sense. So what effect does having a female target audience have on your funeral home's ability to get leads and appeal to these shoppers?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, it's hard to connect with a target audience unless you understand them, unless you understand what they want to learn, what they care about, what matters to them, and then you speak to those concerns. And I want to get into some of the many specific things women are looking for as we go along here today. But first, I think it would be valuable to point something out. If we look at the types of information on most funeral home websites, don't you find that it's mostly about the same? I do. I don't know if you've seen that, but I've looked at I think probably several thousand over the last 10 years. And I think it's this lack of differentiation and lack of individual personality that's been noticed by America, not just online but offline. And I think the proof of that comes out every time somebody says something like, funeral homes, they're all about the same, or I don't like funeral homes, or funeral homes are just expensive. And sadly, that's a lot of negative stuff, and I've never met a funeral home owner who likes to hear that. But maybe your first thought upon hearing those things is, well, the cause of those problems stems from a lot more than just the funeral homes having the same generic things on its website that other funeral homes have on their websites. And sure, that's true. That's true. But It's also true that the website is one of, if not the easiest place to try to nullify and reverse those negatives and those negative opinions. They come to the websites. When they respond to advertising and marketing, they're coming to websites first quite often. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And I've only seen a few funeral home owners that are actually accepting that reality for the challenge that it is and for the opportunity that it is, and really trying to make the most of it.
Okay, then why do you think so few funeral home owners are thinking this way and not investing in the appeal of their website?
Well, I think there are several contributing reasons. The most often cited reason I hear is that the majority of families do not pick a funeral home based on its website. And that is what the surveys from our industry's top consulting firms have shown. But there's at least three key things to note about that general finding. First, when we look at Google Analytics, which we discussed in our podcast or two back, there's tens or scores, or in some cases, hundreds of shoppers on a funeral home's website each month. Now, a lack of phone calls from these shoppers doesn't mean the funeral home didn't get shopped. Also, many people decide to call a business if its website impresses them. And so says a number of studies. In fact, that's actually now taught in a lot of business 101 classes around the country. They're talking about the new phenomena that the internet has brought to commerce, because it used to be advertising and a visit to a store or a call on the phone. And now the vast majority of advertising results in a preliminary visit to a website, or perhaps even a social media space like Facebook. And after that, if the shopper is pleased or satisfied, then they'll go on to the next step of visiting the store, contacting the store by phone or online form, or email. So, again, to go back just to recap, three things about the general finding that says, families don't pick a funeral home based on its website. Well, first, Google Analytics show there's a lot of shoppers who are on funeral home websites each month. Second, nearly all funeral home websites come from just 4 large template website providers, at least in America. And you see their names at all the trade shows. So while the staff and facility pictures are different on most funeral home websites, the generic stock content that they come with is mostly the same for everybody across thousands of websites. So again, that's a failure to stand out and impress. And since a lot of shoppers are coming into their first contact with your brand via your website, they're seeing that you're the same as everybody else. In fact, I remember when Alan Creedy said back in 2010, maybe even earlier, that for many families, the first experience they have with a funeral home now is with its website. And so, a lot of industry experts have noticed this over the years, and there's not a lot of content there that impresses. So that's another reason I'm not surprised families don't cite the website as being a reason they pick the funeral home. But here's the third reason, and this is something you'll find interesting. In the last 2 years, I've noticed a big increase in the number of website clients telling me each month that, hey, a family just told me they picked me because of my website. Now, in 2012, even 2014, I was only hearing that several times a year. There was a few guys who had exceptional websites, and I'd hear it more from them, but generally just a few times a year. But now I'm starting to hear it each month that families are picking funeral homes because of their websites, and that's just shocking, but things to evolve. So I think those three reasons should be considered when you reflect on the stat that the majority of families don't pick a funeral home because of its website. That's true, but the website certainly influences whether or not they call, and whether or not they call excited about what they found, or just one of many others who are the same, and I've got to start somewhere. Here's a couple other things to think about. If just 10 to 20% of families let a website and maybe online reviews influence which funeral home they select, that is still a huge deal to the owner of the funeral home, and because if you pick up an extra 10 or lose an extra 10% of calls each year, that determines whether or not you had a great year, an okay year, or a bad year, right? So can you really afford to neglect the website if you're a funeral home owner? I don't think so. And the last thing I'll say is the more price-oriented a family is, or the more price-oriented a family thinks it is, then the more likely they are to go to the internet to look for a funeral home or a death care provider.
So what do you mean the more price-oriented a family thinks it is?
Well, as you probably heard Batesville and other industry vendors say, many families start out thinking about price, and they're only starting there because they don't know where else to start. And if you've heard Nectar Ramirez speak, she's the director of customer training at Batesville. I think everybody knows who she is. She often talks at state and national conventions about how often families arrive and depart a funeral home without ever having learned of their greater memorialization options. Maybe they come in and start talking about price. A lot of times they'll leave without ever learning about things like cremation jewelry or different ways to personalize. And she shows how more effective communication in the arrangement room greatly changes what the family wants to buy and how satisfied they are with what they buy. But it's really easy to prove that the website could have been the first step in effectively communicating with a number of those families. And it's easy to see that the lion's share of funeral home websites are very weak and or generic and or unappealing in terms of what it is they're communicating. So families who think they're price shoppers and actually they're value shoppers, they get left in the price shopper category because of what they hear in the arrangement room and also what they hear on the website. And actually, I guess what I should say is they're left in the price shopper category because of what they don't hear in the arrangement room. And in relation to this podcast, what they don't hear or don't read or don't see on the website. As we've seen and heard many times over the years, families are willing to pay for the things they find value in. And since they're shopping the website first, before you ever get the chance to talk to them or have them in your arrangement room or give them a tour of your funeral home where they can see what they could have, what they could buy, the website can be doing that for you.
Okay, so yeah, that makes sense. And it's a good segue into discussing what specific types of things can be done on a funeral home website to generate appeal and get more leads, more shopper calls for the funeral home. Can you elaborate about on that a bit, Brian?
Yeah, sure. So let's consider a funeral home website in the context of that scenario I just mentioned. The family that doesn't know what all is available. Well, how could you get more leads or shopper calls from these families by means of your website? And it comes down, again, to effectively doing show and tell. So what should you show and tell about? And there's two things. Obviously, there's the things they want to know about, and then there's the things they don't know that they want to know about. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But first, regarding things they want to know about. Well, if they're going to have some kind of a service, then obviously the chapel space is of prime concern. Well, how many funeral home websites have you seen where the chapel or meeting room space looks bright? Or is it more common that somebody shot that picture with a cell phone or an old digital camera 15 years ago and it looks all dark and gloomy? Now, here's why that's such a big deal. I think you already know, but here's the validation. Back in, it was either 2013 or 2014, I guess 2014, a major study was commissioned by the ICCFA. I'm going to talk about who did that specifically in a few minutes, but it was learned just how many women complain about dark, gloomy chapels and funeral homes. So the worst thing you could do when trying to win business from families that you have not historically served, maybe a family that's historically used your competitor and now they're shopping around, maybe they've never been in your chapel, they're looking at your website, and if they see a low light, a dim picture that looks kind of gloomy, what makes you more appealing than the funeral home they used before? If that was your chance to win them, to win a shopper call and get the chance to win their business, you may have just lost it. The same applies to other rooms like visitation rooms. A lot of times they have that low ceiling, can lights, and there's no natural light in the room, and there aren't enough lamps. And I would just say whenever you're shooting pictures of your chapel or any other room in your building, make sure you have lots of light. In fact, be afraid of washing out the picture. That's when you're probably as much light as you need, and that will directly connect with those female shoppers who want something bright and not something dark and gloomy. Some other things that we know funeral home shoppers are looking for, believe it or not, men, the staff page. The staff page, after your home page and your obituary pages, and quite often your contact us page, the staff page will rank somewhere between the third and sixth most viewed pages on a funeral home website. It doesn't matter what kind of market you're in, whether you're in a big metro area or way out in the country or anything in between. And these women want to see who they're going to be working with. Do they find smiling, kind, warm, inviting faces, from people who are competent and safe, or are they getting the stiff upper lip, big, metal-rimmed engineer glasses from the 1980s and straight-faced with a dull background behind the funeral director? I hate to say it, but we literally are getting judged by how we look in that situation. And there's a great chance to look very warm and inviting and safe versus stolid and down to business. So I think you get the idea. Another thing we know shoppers are looking for, and you may or may not want to share this, and there's different degrees of doing it, but obviously we know the shoppers are looking for pricing, just like we are looking for pricing when we're shopping around online. And there's many cases where funeral homes don't want to show their pricing. Of course, here we're big advocates for being transparent and putting up packages, and we'll talk about that more some other time. But even if you just put price ranges or packages with price ranges and details, specific details, and even better, if you can have pictures that go with it. I've even heard of a few firms that are starting to do videos to go with their packages so that you can actually kind of see, what do I get if I buy this higher end package that includes a chapel and visitation? They have a room for reception and that type of thing. Another thing we learned from, I guess I should get into the study specifics here in a minute, but I'll hold it off just a little bit longer, but regarding package names, and I'm speaking more specifically for a funeral home right now than for a cremation business. There's nothing wrong with calling a package, a simple funeral home package for your base level, but I'd stay away from terms like basic funeral home package or anything that might have a slightly negative connotation, because women, well, nobody wants to, doesn't matter if you're a woman or a man, but women are a little more attuned to this, studies found. They don't want to feel like they're being cheap for their loved one, especially a parent. So anything that makes them feel like, I'm going to the basic, but that's all they could afford, well, you might lose somebody, whereas by simply calling it a simple funeral package instead of a basic funeral package or anything less than that, that might win them, because maybe mom always said she wanted a simple funeral. Granted, we're talking more about the people who go up from here. They have nicer packages, and there's a whole science to that, and we can talk with you about that. And I think, Rob, I think you're actually going to have a podcast about that coming up, but the point there is to stay away from anything that would sound like a negative name or make a woman feel like she's being cheap or cutting back if she goes with the basic package.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, that makes sense. So now, what about things that they don't know they want to know about? Like, so exactly what do you mean by that, Brian?
Sure, and I know that's a little funny. What is it they don't know they want to know that they want to know? So let me give you some context. I read a study a couple of years ago, rather shocking. I'm not sure how large it was, but I certainly had a grain of truth in it I want to hold on to. It said that about half of American families were not satisfied with their funerals, even though they gave very high quality of service, the attentiveness of the funeral director, attention to detail. They said they had compassionate care. The funeral home facilities were very clean, whether it was old or new, big or small. And so when they were asked why they weren't satisfied, the common answer was, well, we wanted something a little different. Okay, well, obviously, we want to know what that is. And when they were asked, well, what is it that you wanted different? What did you want it to look like, or what did you want to see? What did you want to experience? And the response that came back was, well, we don't know, but we'll know it when we see it. And so the conclusion was that these were the baby boomers that have historically looked to change things up, to make it their way. And I don't think that's new to anybody. Anybody who's been paying attention to what's being said by the thought leaders or just what you've been experienced with families knows that to be true. But boomers are looking for something different. Well, can you think of a more ideal situation for appealing to a consumer with something new and different than a website? I mean, they're basically pulling up your online employee and saying, what can you do for me? What do you have to offer me? That's just the context for shoppers that are looking for something more than an average traditional religious-based funeral service. And we haven't even talked about all the things that female shoppers, they're 72% of the equation. We haven't talked about all the specifics they're looking for, and we're going to get into that. But this is an ideal situation to present things that are new, that are different flavor, and generate interest. Where people are like, wow, I haven't seen that before. The last two funeral home websites looked the same. They had a chapel, they had a staff, they had some general information. They showed me pictures of caskets. I guess I have to call them if I want to learn anything else. But on this website, wow, I've never seen that before. So probably the biggest, quote, didn't know I wanted to know thing is when you show something they didn't even know existed or that could exist. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So several years ago, the first thing I saw coming out and making its way from the casket vendors onto websites were examples of personalized funerals. So maybe we've all seen this. There's the golf cart at the front of the room and the bag of golf clubs and maybe even some fake grass, and they make a miniature green and they create a whole setting or a scene that represents an interest or a passion of the loved one. And families still love that. So having pictures on websites of that started to show up, and that started to open the eyes of the less imaginative, we could say, of like, oh, that's a neat idea. We could do that. I really like that. And that would generate some calls. More recently, pages on websites that talk about things like signature services or special things we offer. Maybe you highlight the fact that you've got a kids' room. You may not have thought of this, but again, statistically, 72% of death care shoppers are women. These women are busy. Most of them have professions as well as their home life. They've got to manage kids, manage a household. A lot of them are divorced. And so they don't have, maybe it's just them and the kids. They're very busy and under pressure, and they're trying to take care of a funeral. Or if they're older, their kids are still teens, but you get the idea. Seeing that you have a kids' room, that could be a real appeal, knowing that you're going to make it easy for them. Maybe you talk about some of the more common things like a dove release or a balloon release or having a bagpiper. But I've also seen newer things like having a farewell ride on a motorcycle hearse, or even newer, maybe you have a Gone to the Force Star Wars send-off experience. And that might seem kind of ridiculous, but hey, doesn't have to be cheap. And I wouldn't mind doing a Star Wars send-off experience for $8,000. How about you? And obviously pictures are worth 1,000 words in these cases, and video, if done right, is worth even more. Now you might be thinking, well, how do I do this? Would I have to stage this? Do I have to bring in actors and decorate it all up myself? And I have two answers to that. My first answer is it would absolutely be worth it, especially if you're in a suburban or metro market. It would absolutely be worth it because of how many people are looking for something different. And what you're trying to do is not spell out all the different things you can do. We're trying to show them some and get them to realize that, hey, whatever you want to do, we can do it here. That being said, I've noticed over the years that many funeral homes have one or two really over-the-top funerals each year. And these are prime opportunities for you to get some pictures. And I'm not suggesting that you get in there and take pictures of everybody in attendance where we have faces and now we have to worry about getting permission, written sign-offs, legal release to use those images from each person in the picture. But I have known funeral homes who will run their staff in there. Let's say the funeral's not starting for a couple hours, and they'll run their staff in there and even call a few friends if they know it's going to be a good one, and shoot the picture from behind the heads on one side of the chapel and capture the front of the room, and they're able to get an image that's very usable. Or maybe it's in the arrangement room or the reception room, particularly beautiful buffet setup, and maybe there's extra large pictures or posters or any kind of paraphernalia over in the corner of the room. These are pictures that bring ideas alive in the minds of consumers, and the consumers who are looking for ideas, they engage with that. I've seen, I think probably this gets credited to foundation partners, is we're starting to see giant video screens in funeral home chapels. And by giant, I mean the size of one whole wall, usually at the front of the chapel or most of the wall, depending how large the building is. but the room is. I've seen chapels who are putting multiple screens in there, and they're starting to create whole video experiences or video immersion experiences or larger than life video experiences. I know there's a senior center in Florida that Foundation Partners works with, and they've basically got their own event space that it's often used for funerals, and they're putting in they already did put in a massive video screen in that space, and it kind of sounds funny to talk about it, but all the seniors who live there, I guess most of them are being good sports, because many of them have said, wow, that's amazing. They've been to a few funerals now in that space, and they've done a great video on that enormous screen, and it's the buzz of the senior community. So again, sounds a little funny to talk about, but these are different ideas and ways that we can generate interest, which creates appeal for shoppers who are looking for something different. And the result is either shopper calls, or at the very least downloads of brochures, or maybe you have some great ideas on PDFs, ideas you can use for planning a great funeral or a meaningful send-off, or let's not just call it funeral. A celebration of life is certainly a big piece of this. I haven't used that term, and I should. Celebration of life is a big piece. So these are things we can do to generate interest and appeal on the website.
So what are some of the things consumers want to know, Brian? Like what would you say are specific types of information a website needs to have to stand out and generate more leads and get more shopper calls?
Yeah, that's certainly the question we're here to answer. And to answer that question, I'd like to refer back now specifically to the study that I've cited. And that was by a marketing expert. Her name is Bridget Brennan. You may have heard of her. She authored the book, Why She Buys. And she's a contributing writer to Forbes. Actually, ICCFA also commissioned her to do a study. I think it was in 2014. It was titled, Optimizing the Funeral Arrangement Experience to Attract the Largest Market Sector. I know that's a long title, but that's what it was. However, you may have heard her present it. I know she presented it at the ICCFA. I heard her presented it at the New Jersey Funeral Directors Convention. But I want to talk about some of the critical findings she has, and you can see very clearly how these can directly connect to the types of content we need to have on a website to be more appealing and generate more leads and more calls. Now, she interviewed a large number of women in two markets. She picked a market in Illinois and a market in Florida. And she didn't just do surveys in the mail. There was surveying, but there's also a lot of interviews, scores and scores of interviews in each market. And let's notice some of the things that were learned. When she asked these women, what are ways that you'd like to personalize? And by the way, that term personalize is not a term that many consumers know when they first hear it. It's not an intuitive term. I'm just using it here because as death care industry professionals, we all understand it. But among the top 7 things that were listed were to play specific music. Well, most of you offer that. The ability to play videos. Again, not new. Hang pictures of a loved one up. To serve cherished foods. Showcase favorite food. That's one we might not think about as much if we're men in the industry. Individualized ceremonial touches. And maybe that's a more common phrase. Individualized ceremonial touches as opposed to personalized. Sounds longer, but that's the words they used. And wanted to be able to make a presentation on an iPad that was set to music and have that be a part of the experience. And we might call that a video tribute, but also just a presentation where they're showing a person's life, almost like a show and tell. And that certainly is a trend in the direction of the new celebration of life direction that more and more funerals are going in. Except for perhaps that last one, none of these are new things, are they? We've all heard of these things. But how many of you have pictures, nice, beautiful pictures or appealing descriptions, because obviously you can't have a picture of music being played, that spells out and shows how you do these types of things? And do you call out these things as special things you can do in a service that our funeral home will help you do to make sure your service is the most meaningful and the most individualized for your loved one? Things like this. So these are specific things that can be done. And again, you have to use a little bit of creativity, but as far as taking pictures of people eating a special food, whether it's ethnic or maybe they just loved pizza, I don't know. It could be whatever. So I'll leave off with that there. There's so much data that was in that study she did that's just outstanding because there's a lot of first-person feedback. Another competitively critical area is that of the celebration of life. And why that's so important is Bridget's study found that many women found a celebration of life more appealing than a traditional ceremony. Again, that's nothing we haven't heard, but just want to put that back out there again. If your website isn't specific, both traditional funerals and celebration of life, you're in trouble. And the reason I say that is you may have heard of a couple of famous authors, Al Reese and Jack Trout. They're famous for some of the books they wrote in the 90s, some great thought leaders in America. One of them was called Positioning, How to Be Seen and Heard in the Overcrowded Marketplace. But another one that's really fantastic was the 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. And one of the things they talk about in that book is how you have, quite often in a market as it matures, you end up having two choices. You have the old tried and true, and then you have what's new. And of course, traditional funerals have been the tried and true for, a century or longer? Actually, you could say forever in America. But this whole celebration of life is the new up-and-coming trend. Kind of like how there was Coca-Cola for decades, and then along came Pepsi, the choice of the new generation. Well, this celebration of life is the new thing. It's not new to hear anybody talk about it, but if it's not on your website, you're behind the times. And people who are looking for a celebration of life and they find big pictures of groups of people doing everything from sitting in chairs or pews watching a video to playing a round of putt-putt golf inside your chapel, let's say, which might sound crazy. Or maybe they leave your chapel and there's a picture of them leaving, and the next picture is them running along behind the hearse in running gear, and the last picture is them running through a cemetery on the way to the gravesite. And that idea actually already happened. It was covered in Runner's World. Those are the kinds of ideas that bring a lot of interest and engage the attention of consumers who are looking for something different. So, these are some specific things we could put on the website in terms of pictures and descriptions that would really get interest. The last thing I want to mention there that's very easy, almost all of you already have this. You already have a sound system in your chapel, right? Many of you already have cameras installed. Does your website say that you have a sound system? It can sound funny, but a lot of people just assume, oh, it's a funeral home. I don't know what they have there. Tell them that you have a sound system. Have a page in your About Us section or in What We Offer where you talk about our sound system and video capabilities. People want to know that stuff. That makes you stand out from just an average funeral home. It shouldn't. Everybody should have these items on their website, but they don't.
Brian, this is it's really interesting, especially when you're talking about celebration of life. And in Canada, the most recent survey that was done, although it was 2010, 2011, and now remember that over 60% of Canadians want to be cremated. The survey said that 73% of Canadians want a celebration of life for themselves. So, more than the people who want cremation are saying they want a celebration of life. And so I've made a challenge to funeral homes, and the people who have done that say that this just works great. Just take on your GPL where you have your traditional funeral service, go into Word or whatever document program you have, copy it, paste it with the same price, same details and everything, and just title it Celebration of Life. So, maybe change the words around a little bit, but, have that on your price list, because someone might gloss over a traditional funeral, and then right there, right next, right below it, it might say Celebration of Life, and they may stop reading the rest of the document. And folks who have done this have said, that one move has made them, more money than any other simple little fix that they could do, especially just to their GPL. So I just wanted to to share that, since we're on that fact. People use that term. I know a lot of industry people don't like to use that term, but as you said, we should use the talk their language, and which leads me to the next question: anything that we should have or really not have on the website? Like, is there anything that we should avoid in our website content?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the biggest ones turned up in that study that Bridget did was industry jargon. One of the quotes I enjoyed that she shared, she said, quote, "They used words like remains, which was a very new thing for me. It was very insensitive. They need to come up with some other terminology." And that's pretty close to an exact quote. I think I typed it all down right. But this was something that one of the women said that she talked to. And then Bridget went on to explain to those of us in the audience that there were actually, she heard that over and over and over. People, especially women, hate the word remains. That's their mother, or that's their father, or that's their sister or their brother. Those aren't remains. And they get upset about a human being being referred to as remains. And I think we all understand that, so I won't belabor the point. But if your website was written by a quote-unquote professional copyright writer, end quote, who doesn't know what they don't know, and so they come in and they interview you and then they start to write your content, and they're using words like remains, well, you don't realize it, but you are really putting up a red flag in the face of people, or of some women, when you could be using terms like loved one, like we take your loved one into our care, and we do this with your loved one, versus, and we'll, you get back your mother's ashes or your loved one's ashes, as opposed to back the remains. You get back the remains. I think you understand what I'm saying. So industry jargon. Another one that I find this industry just does not want to let go of is the term pre-need. And I'll share with you an interesting insight. Having been in the serving, doing websites for funeral homes for about 10 years, for over 10 years now, I've watched a lot of employees come through the two companies I've worked at, and in every case, there's always a few words that a new employee says, "Hey, what's that? I never heard of that before." And one of these words is pre-need. And we're so used to hearing it, and the pre-need insurance companies out there talk about it, that we just want consumers to do it our way. We want consumers to accept that. But, you can fight that battle. You could also just use the term plan ahead on your website instead of pre-need. Come on in and pre-need today. I guess they mean they want us to plan our funeral. Why don't you just say plan ahead? So look for jargon, for words that aren't intuitive. Or if you ever have families say, "What's that?" or look at you with a puzzled expression when they're in the arrangement room, take a second and write yourself a note about that word, because words matter. And as most of you fellows know who are listening, women are typically considered a lot more effective communicators, a lot more tuned to detail. And again, women are our target audience here. So jargon is something we need to avoid. Another thing that we need to avoid, or actually kind of avoid / do the right way, is in that study, Bridget said a lot of women expressed emotional concerns about the whole process of arranging a funeral. And so, as a marketer, I'm thinking, well, hey, as a customer service is making a great first impression, one of the best ways I can win their interest and make them more interested in talking to me than the other guys is on my website, I can reach out right away. This verbiage that talks about what the arrangement experience is like at ABC Funeral Home. That title would get the attention of like, yeah, what is the arrangement experience like? Because I'm kind of worried about that. And if the other 2, 3, 5, 6 funeral homes in town aren't talking anything about that, and your website has a page, it's even a call to action box right on the home page. What is the arrangement experience like? What you need to know? And then you start to get into answers that nullify these the three top concerns I'm about to mention right now, which were, will I get taken advantage of? Will I overspend? And notice this last one, which fellows normally wouldn't think. Will I do this right? These are three big concerns, the three top concerns that came out of that study. And this is even in 2 sections of the country in different types of markets. This is a well-done study. So if your website's content is removing anything that causes concerns, whether it's gloomy pictures or bad verbiage like remains, and looking to insert verbiage and features and information that nullify fears and create a sense of safety and well-being, that's going to be good for you. And I want to also point out here 3 other things. There's several ways to make the female shopper feel less vulnerable. And I'm not trying to get all psychological on us, but then again, sales and marketing has always been about shopper psychology and how to connect with the shopper, because if you're what they think they're looking for, they'll buy you. If you're the expert they think they want, they'll buy you. So here's 3 things. Tell them that you're interested in having their funeral or their celebration of life experience be the way they want it, with the trappings they want, at the price they can pay, that you have a solution for them that's going to fit. And look for ways to get specific. And I could delve into that quite a bit. It's a little bit easier to do in a conversation than a straight, I think, podcast presentation. And I do see a lot of funeral homes that say, you can get what you want at the price you want, or we have packages for every budget, but look for ways to express interest in them being satisfied and having the experience they want. A second way to help reduce a feeling of vulnerability is tell them you'll give them space and privacy to make their decisions. One of the quotes I read from a lady that was surveyed in that study said, well, actually there's 2 contrasting quotes. One of them who said, I wish they would have just gone away and give us some time to think about it. And I know many of you do that. I've heard many funeral home owners who say, after we talk, then I'll just get up and leave the room. And I find that works wonders. I'll just leave the room and go out and give them some time. When I come back, I can tell if they need more time or not. And I'll give them the time they need, and it works wonders for us, builds a great reputation. Families are happy with what they buy, and that's a win-win for everybody. But there's many funeral directors who aren't doing that. And as, again, I'll quote him, as Alan Creedy pointed out, and I totally agree with this, even though I'm not an expert on it by any means, if a funeral home owner doesn't know what their funeral directors are doing in the arrangement room, if they haven't watched how their funeral directors are conducting arrangements, then you don't really know how your brand is being represented if it's not being represented by you, do you? So make sure that what you're saying on your website is actually getting backed up in the arrangement room. And then the third way to appeal to a female shopper and remove any feelings of vulnerability is to package her options into appealing plans. And again, I won't try to get into this in detail. Rob's going to talk about this more, but what a woman finds quote-unquote appealing versus what a man finds quote-unquote appealing, as you might imagine, can be a lot different. And with 72% of our audience being female, that's something we fellas really need to think about and focus on in order to maximize happy customers and also our bottom line. A couple of the things I'll share here is that in that study, women said the decisions they made when choosing what they wanted for final arrangements reflected on them personally. It reflected on their tastes. It reflected on their love and respect for the deceased, which, by the way, they don't like that term very much either, deceased, the one who had died. And it also reflected on their budget. And they didn't want to look cheap. So one thing I will just quickly touch back on related to packages, I lightly mentioned it earlier, was that they don't want to look cheap. They want to look like they're making upgrades. They don't want to look like they're cutting back on features. So they want to feel like they're making an upgrade when they add to the package, but like the starting package isn't a bad thing. So really consider that when naming your packages. And again, we'll talk about that more in the future, or feel free to call in and talk about that with us. Another 2 other things here, things we can do to help female shoppers feel less vulnerable. Emphasize that your staff is there for them whenever she needs them. And that's a big deal. Now, granted, most funeral homes have been doing that for decades or longer. There's all kinds of legendary stories of how the phone rings in the middle of the night. I remember, I think John McQueen said his dad used to always had somebody spending the night down there in their funeral home. So no matter what time a call came or there was always somebody there for them. Times have changed a little, but that's still the spirit of the traditional funeral home. Make sure it's spelled out on your website. And you might consider spelling it out in modern terms. We're available for you however you need, including phone calls, emails, text messaging. You shudder to hear it. There's families who are reaching out for a first contact through Facebook, and not just low-cost shoppers. We can talk about that later. But Facebook is a growing medium for regular communication. So that's just going to be in the wheelhouse, the skill set of any effective business going forward. You need to be planning for it. And finally, we need to assure them that getting hold of the staff will be easy whenever they're needed. It kind of fits in with what I just said, but it's going to be easy to get hold of us through any of these means. We're here for you. We want to make this as easy and as convenient as it can. Again, because a lot of these female shoppers are, they're managing families and they have careers. Their kids have after school things. Now they have all this pressure of a loved one who's died. If they're single, they don't have the aid of a partner or a spouse to help them, that just adds more pressure. And they're looking for things to reduce pressure, to make it fast and easy, and still also to be meaningful and fulfilling, and where they feel like they've honored and cherished their loved one with the choices that they've made. And they want reassurance that they've done that. And there's just a lot that goes into communicating that. Now, having heard all that, which is quite a bit, and still I feel like it's general. I didn't get into maybe as many specifics, but it really gets nitty-gritty. But having heard all that, hopefully we begin to see just how lacking the content has been on death care websites. And, if you ever want an example of some good content, maybe look through some of the leading senior retirement centers, or another favorite example I have is leading resorts and hotels and your favorite vacation spots where the competition is intense and there's lots of contenders that have skilled marketing and advertising departments. Like, pick your favorite beach where there's a Marriott, a Hyatt, and a Sheraton, and see just how specific and visual they get in explaining what all they have to offer. Those are good examples. But overall, hopefully this will help us increase the level of specific, attractive, engaging, and appealing information we put on our websites that will generate more interest and more shopper calls and more contacts and more leads from families, whether it's an at-need situation or they're planning ahead.
Hey, Brian, this has been great. It's just a great piece of education for folks to really look at their funeral home website and kind of assess it. And that's why, we've made available for you here on the website the self-assessment that you can download. Just review that, and then make sure going forward that you're thinking about that when you want to when you're updating your website, when you're getting a photographer in to take new photographs, the terminology that you're using or maybe shouldn't use. All those things should weigh on your mind, and make those changes as soon as you can. So once again, Brian, that was just great. Also, too, one thing that I wanted to let you know is that at Funeral Results Marketing, we are in the beginning stages of planning our first live conference that we're going to have. The details will be found at cremationconference.com, and this will be in the fall, probably September or October. So look for those details, and both Brian and I are excited about that. And if you have any burning questions at all about online marketing for your funeral home, about your website, your online cremation business, make sure you leave it here, below this episode, and we'll try to answer it on an upcoming episode. And if you like what you're hearing, please leave a comment on the blog, or give us a rating on iTunes or Google Play. We'd really appreciate that. And but most importantly, thank you for taking your time today, spending it with us. Our goal for you is to serve more families and provide more meaningful services. Make sure you check back soon for another episode of Strategy Talks by Funeral Results Marketing. Until the next episode, this has been Brian Young and Robin Heppel.
This has been another episode of Strategy Talks with Robin Heppel and Brian Young. To ask a question or leave a comment, visit funeralresultsmarketing.com/talks. To make sure that you never miss an episode, you can subscribe to this podcast for free on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher.